Yes, I'm ready. Go. So. I was a freshman in 1965 at the University of Hartford. I graduated from Northwest Catholic High School, and my oldest friend to this day, Bill Wallach, was a freshman in the same year. He went to East Catholic High School, so we hooked up about the second or third day of orientation, and I think the fourth day, the Thursday of orientation, after registration was done and everything, we had a picnic for freshmen out at a YMCA camp where Bill and I both ran into this kind of whiny-throated folk singer guy with an incredible Martin guitar and doing songs like St. James Infirmary Blues and a couple of Bob Dylan songs and Stormy Monday and all the classics, and we kind of formed the basis of a group of us who became associated over the years at the university. The university newspaper in 1965 was called the Call Board. It regularly published about an 8-page paper. It was filled with news about fraternities and sports and news releases from the Public Relations Department of the university about how great our growing university was. By growing, when I was a freshman, we only had about 1,500 full-time students at the university. And the only buildings on campus were University Hall with Arbach Auditorium attached, and the Hart College with Millard Auditorium, and the art school. And that was all there was. The administration was centered in North House, and the public relations department was in a location called South Cottage. And that was all the facilities the university had on campus. They began building a student center, the Jenger Student Center. They began building a science and engineering building. They began building dormitories. In our freshman year, this was, let me go back just a second. Say the University's Hartford's identification would be as a primarily Republican school. It existed to train people for jobs with Pratt & Whitney or Travelers or Aetna or the insurance companies or the banks. It was a school not known for doing extensive amounts of research or taking grants to do research. They had a teaching faculty. I chose the University of Hartford because Trinity would have required me to have a competence in math that I never could have handled, and the University of Hartford allowed me to choose foreign languages instead of taking math. My dad was dying of ALS, so I had to stay at home to help take care of his therapy and stuff, and so I ended up at the University of Hartford. Bill Wallach and I both were involved in advanced placement English and advanced placement history. And for the first 2 years of our student career at the university, we did like 4 years worth of requirements in 2 years in both English and literature and history, world history, American history, European history. Which gave me a great start to begin to explore other things that I discovered were of interest to me. I spent a lot of time in my freshman year playing setback for money in the student lounge. The big event at the university in November of '65 was a pro-war teach-in sponsored by the university administration so that we'd all be on the right page in supporting the war in Vietnam. They had a lot of famous people. You could probably research and find out who they were, who worked for the Defense Department and the State Department. And some of them went up very high in government as the years progressed. And they had one guy who was opposed to the war, and he was kind of an idiot. But everything the guys who were for the war said just rang hollow. None of it was real. And instead of engendering support for the war, it created an on-campus student opposition to the war, which hadn't existed before the teach-in. In March of '66, still freshman year, my dad died. And so I was kind of liberated a little bit. That fall, my sophomore year, my grandmother died, so we moved to the old family house on Walbridge Road. And I started to get an apartment. I got an apartment on Frederick Street. And then in the spring of '68, a bunch of us got together and rented a house that we called the Submarine. The call board was a pretty dull paper. It was a public relations screed for the University of Hartford. In 1966 through '67, Dan Riley became editor of the student newspaper, changed the name to the Cauldron as Cauldron Boyle in the Macbeth scene, and we became a larger paper. I was on the staff of the Cauldron. It was an insightful and pretty experiment in student journalism for 1966-67. It covered issues like the war. It covered issues like women's reproductive rights and abortion and birth control. And remember, in 1966, it was illegal in Connecticut to give information about birth control to unmarried women. That was a crime. Needless to say, the Cauldron caused a great deal of consternation with the university administration. It was not a popular newspaper except with the students. Dan Riley was aided by an excellent assistant editor named John Robinson, Jeff Lewis, Bob Skinner, a number of really smart people who did some unusual work considering the time that they were in. We followed after the example of a guy named Ray Mungo and his paper, the BU News. We covered some of the same subjects they did. We printed some of their articles. They printed some of our articles. We became very friendly with Ray and Alan, who went on to form Liberation News Service in the fall of 1967. In the spring of '67, there was a large anti-war rally in New York City, and the University of Hartford sent a couple hundred people down to New York for that demonstration. Pete Seeger played, Peter, Paul, and Mary were there. It was a huge event. Julian Bond spoke for SNCC. It was quite an event. In the fall of '67, there was a change in editorship of the newspaper, and Ed Butler became editor of the paper, and they changed the name back to The Challenge. It purported to be a active student newspaper, went back to publishing more press releases from the University Public Relations Department, and had kind of a Fox News sort of fair and balanced attitude about the stuff that it covered. Very little movement news, very little war news, more sports, more fraternity news, few more pages than the call board, but still not the size of the enterprise that the cauldron represented. There was, in the winter of back up. I need to go back. No, just, you're going to have to edit this out.
Fine.
Incoming freshmen in 1967 were greeted with a new newspaper and a new editor, Ed Butler. It was a conservative newspaper, kind of on the Fox News fair and balanced, boring sort of end of the spectrum. It printed some of our material, but it always made sure that it presented the other side, and it was a mouthpiece for the university administration. In the fall of '67, there was a huge anti-war demonstration at the Pentagon. This was the infamous levitation of the Pentagon, and it was an incredibly disturbing event to those of us in the movement. Regardless of what you may have heard or seen on your television, hundreds of thousands of protesters in Washington, D.C., the 82nd Airborne from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, came up to be the guard at the Pentagon. Halfway through the afternoon, as young women in the crowd were enticing soldiers to desert their posts and throw down their arms and offering themselves as door prizes to anyone who would desert from the army. And they would have been spirited out of the crowd and gone. But the army was having a hard time, and about 3 p.m, they left the front of the Pentagon, and about 1,500 guys in rubberized jumpsuits with no unit insignias, no name tags, no badges, no nothing, just these wire clubs like the South Africans used to put down the African movement in South Africa. And these guys just moved through the crowd, brutally beating people up. We had a permit to occupy the north parking lot at the Pentagon, but people who were trying to leave the north parking lot to go to the legally permitted bus service spaces had to run a gauntlet between these great jumpsuited thugs and just got beaten and beaten and beaten. And as we were listening to the radio on the ride home, we learned that they accused us of firing tear gas at the marshals. The gray-suited thugs turned out to be the U.S. Marshals. Out of uniform, no badges, not much law enforcement. Anyway, we sent several hundred people to the demonstration in Washington, and they became a very hardcore cadre of people who were adherents to pretty much all of the agenda of the New Left. Citizen participation in government, against the war, against the draft, in favor of women's rights. And in February of 1968, there was a very unfortunate incident at the Student Center. A student with epilepsy had some kind of fit getting off the elevator in the Student Center and fell down on the floor. He was flopping around, and one of the university security guards came over and said to him, "Knock off that hippie shit, fella," and started to slap him about the face and head, and took a long time before anyone called the guy an ambulance. And I arrived on campus the next morning to find out about this, and there were about 300, 400 very angry students from the dorms saying no security guard had a right to treat a student that way, regardless of what the circumstances might be. And even though this was a health emergency, that the security guard was so blinded that he could not see what it was. This crowd took off for North House, ready to take the place apart. And it's always easier to lead a parade than it is to start one, so I jumped in front of the crowd and I said to the people on the lawn of North House, let me go talk to them, see what we can do. There was a meeting of the University Administrative Council in progress as I walked into North House, and they ushered me into the meeting of the Administrative Council. And I said, I don't lead this thing. I'm just kind of here to speak for people. This is what we want. We want a student role in the administration of the university. We want a student seat on the Board of Regents. We want a change in visiting hours and dorm rules. We want autonomy for the funds in the student government. We want a student body tax to support the student government instead of a student activity fee. And we want training in first aid for security guards and a whole different attitude in the people who are there to serve our needs. And then I said to them, now look, you can't give me all that right now, but you're going to agree to change the dorm rules, and you are going to agree to train the security guards, and you're going to give in on all the other stuff in negotiation. Now, before they tear the place apart, tell me that we won that, and I'll go out and everybody will go home happy. And they agreed. It never pays not to speak knowledge to power, and you gain a lot when power concedes to you. I had a private meeting with Dr. Woodruff, and if I had been a bone in my hair cannibal from a South Pacific island, I probably would have been treated better than I was in that meeting with him. I told him, I said, this is never going to work. I cannot work with you. Give me someone who can make decisions and they will stick. And so I was turned over to Hector Prudhomme, who was the university's administrative assistant, and he and I carried on the warmest of relationships for the next 4 or 5 years. We agreed on a student tax. We agreed on autonomy over funds for the student government, with one proviso, that we couldn't buy guns or ammunition. And I said, I have no intention of buying guns and ammunition. My intention is to buy paper and ink.
Oh.